Robert Hayes stepped off the transport shuttle onto the crystalline surface of Zephyr 7, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. After spending more than half his life fixing broken starship engines and cramped maintenance tunnels, dealing with angry captains and impossible deadlines, he finally had time to breathe. The planet's tropical air wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Massive bioluminescent crystal formations towered above the landing pad, glowing soft blues and greens that seemed to pulse with life. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at the natural beauty, before a resort attendant approached him with a welcoming smile. The resort itself was a marvel of luxury. Robert had saved for years to afford this 2-week package, and it was everything the travel brochures promised. The hotel staff treated him like royalty. They showed him to a comfortable room with a view of the luminescent caverns in the distance. Those caverns were the main attraction on Zephyr 7. Thousands of tourists visited every year to see the natural wonders and the glowing organisms that lived in the darkness below the surface. The caverns had been completely mapped by the Planetary Authority. Every safe route was marked. Every dangerous area was clearly labeled. There was nothing to worry about. This was supposed to be the perfect vacation. For the first 2 days, Robert followed the rules. He took the official tour with a guide who spoke in a bored monotone about the history of the caverns and the biology of the luminescent creatures. Robert walked where everyone walked, stood where everyone stood, and took pictures that looked exactly like millions of other pictures taken by millions of other tourists. It was pleasant enough, but something inside him rebelled against the sameness of it all. Robert had spent 15 years following procedures and regulations. He knew safety protocols inside and out. He understood engineering principles that most people would never even think about. The official tour felt like a cage to him. On the third morning, Robert decided to do something different. He packed a small bag with water, energy bars, a basic first aid kit, and his personal communication device. He told the hotel he was going on a private hike. The attendant at the desk warned him about staying on the marked paths, but Robert just smiled and nodded. He was a competent man. He could handle a simple cave exploration. Besides, he was tired of doing what he was supposed to do. For once in his life, he wanted to follow his curiosity instead of a guidebook. The entrance to the luminescent caverns was about an hour's walk from the resort. Robert took his time enjoying the alien landscape. The vegetation here was nothing like Earth's plants. The trees had translucent leaves that seemed to filter the sunlight into rainbow patterns. Strange creatures that looked like a cross between birds and insects flew overhead, their wings catching the light as they moved. Robert found himself smiling. This was what he had wanted. Not crowds and tour guides, but real exploration. Real discovery. When Robert reached the cavern entrance, the bioluminescent organisms were already putting on their show. The walls glowed with soft light in shades of blue, green, and purple. It was genuinely beautiful. He followed the main path for a while, descending deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler and the sounds of the world above faded away. He could hear the drip of water echoing through the darkness, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to measure time in a new way down here. Robert's fitness tracker buzzed on his wrist, showing him his progress. He had been hiking for 45 minutes. The device also measured air quality, temperature, and even attempted to provide navigation data. It was a quality piece of equipment, expensive and reliable. Robert trusted it more than he trusted the painted markers on the walls. He decided to venture off the main path, following a smaller tunnel that branched to the left. The tour guide had mentioned these secondary passages but recommended that tourists stay on the main route. Robert, however, was not a typical tourist. The smaller tunnel twisted and turned, descending at a steeper angle than Robert expected. The bioluminescent organisms here were less abundant, so the light was dimmer. Robert activated the flashlight on his personal device and continued forward. His mechanical mind began calculating the geology as he walked. The crystal formations he passed suggested water flow patterns and mineral deposits. He found himself analyzing the structures like he would analyze a broken engine. What forces shaped these caverns? How long did it take for these crystals to grow? His curiosity pulled him deeper. Then his fitness tracker made a strange noise and went dark. The screen flickered once, twice, and then nothing. Dead. Robert frowned and tapped it against his palm, but it remained unresponsive. He wasn't overly concerned. Electronics failed sometimes, even good ones. The cavern's mineral content might have interfered with the device. It happened. He still had his communication device if he needed to call for help, and he was confident he could navigate back to the main passage without the tracker. Robert continued forward, and the tunnel opened into something much larger. A massive cavern stretched out before him, so huge that his flashlight beam couldn't reach the far wall. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above. Robert's breath caught. He had been hiking for nearly 2 hours, and this cavern was not marked on any of the official maps he had studied. This was something undiscovered. Something unknown. He stepped forward carefully, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. That's when he saw it. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was looking at. There was a shape against the far wall, something geometric and unnatural in this landscape of organic crystal formations. It was massive, easily hundreds of meters long. As his eyes adjusted and he moved closer, the shape resolved into something impossible. It was a ship. A spacecraft. Ancient and heavily corroded, half buried in the cavern wall as if it had crashed there centuries ago. Maybe longer than that. Maybe much longer. Robert stood frozen, staring at the vessel. His mechanical training kicked in immediately. He began analyzing the damage patterns, the structural integrity, the composition of the hull. The metal was unlike anything he had encountered in his 15 years working with Starship technology. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. Strange symbols covered parts of the hull, and some of them seemed to glow faintly with their own light, independent of the bioluminescent organisms. As Robert watched, those symbols pulsed almost like a heartbeat. Almost like the ship was alive. Robert approached the ancient ship slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of mechanical work was screaming at him to be careful. This was something important. This was something dangerous. As he drew closer, he could see more details of the vessel's construction. The landing ramp was partially lowered, creating a dark opening that seemed to invite him inside. The metal surrounding the opening was corroded and damaged, but not from simple age. Something had burned into the hull from the inside. Something had tried to escape. He placed his hand on the cold metal of the landing ramp. It felt solid, still structurally sound despite its age. Robert's mechanical mind began working through the problem. If this ship had crashed here 3,000 years ago or even much longer, how was it still intact? The answer came to him quickly. There had to be some kind of preservation field active. Stasis technology. He had read about such things in technical journals, but he had never actually seen it in operation. The air around the ship felt different, almost like walking through an invisible barrier that made his skin prickle. Robert took a deep breath and stepped onto the landing ramp. The metal groaned slightly under his weight, but it held. He moved carefully toward the open entrance, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness inside the ship. The interior was vast, with corridors stretching off in multiple directions. Emergency lights flickered on and off randomly, some still powered by whatever ancient systems kept this vessel functioning. The ship was much larger on the inside than it had appeared from outside, and Robert realized it must extend deeper into the cavern wall than he had initially thought. He found the main control room relatively quickly, following the layout that seemed familiar despite the alien design. The controls were arranged in a way that made sense, even if the symbols and interfaces were completely foreign. Robert moved to what appeared to be a data terminal. It was covered in dust and corrosion, but when he brushed away the debris, he could see that something inside was still active. There was a faint glow coming from beneath the degraded surface. With careful, deliberate movements, he began to work on the terminal, using basic mechanical principles to access its systems. The ship's records activated with a sound like a long sigh. Data began to scroll across a screen that somehow still functioned despite the millennia that had passed. Robert squinted at the symbols, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then, miraculously, the system recognized his presence and began to translate. A voice spoke in his language, ancient and tired, explaining the history of the ship. The vessel was called the Meridian. It belonged to a species called the Korvathi, advanced space explorers who had mapped dozens of star systems. They were scientists and discoverers, seeking knowledge across the galaxy. According to the records, the Korvathi mission had been successful for many years. They explored new worlds, made discoveries, and expanded their understanding of the universe. Then something changed. The logs became filled with warnings and urgent messages. The crew had found something on a distant planet, something they did not understand. Something they brought aboard the Meridian. The records were fragmented and difficult to interpret, but Robert gathered that this thing, whatever it was, had begun to affect the crew members one by one. People started acting strangely. Crew members disappeared. Orders became confused and contradictory. Robert found the captain's personal logs preserved in a separate section of the database. He activated them and listened as a female voice, speaking through the translation system, explained what had happened. The captain explained that the entity they had discovered was not a creature in any normal sense. It was something older and stranger, something that could infiltrate biological beings and alter their consciousness. It learned from them. It copied their knowledge and used it to manipulate others. As the Korvathi crew members fell under its influence, they became extensions of its will. They no longer thought as individuals. They became parts of something larger and more terrible. The captain described the moment she realized the truth. She had begun to feel the presence inside her own mind, subtle at first, like an itch she could not scratch. She knew then that the entity had targeted her, the leader. It wanted to use her authority to spread itself to the planets below. The captain made a choice. She could not destroy the creature in space where it might escape and find other prey. She could not allow it to reach populated worlds. So she did the only thing she could do. She ordered the ship to crash on this remote, uninhabited world. She locked all the systems into a containment protocol and ensured that the stasis field would keep the creature dormant, trapped, unable to escape or reproduce or spread to other beings. The final log entries were the most disturbing. The captain described feeling the entity fighting inside her mind, trying to resist her commands, trying to take control of her hands so she could override the crash sequence. She described it as a constant war, a battle for control of her own body and thoughts. She urged anyone who found this ship to understand the danger. She warned that the creature was not dead. Dormant, yes, but not dead. It could awaken if the stasis field failed. It could awaken if disturbed by certain frequencies or energy signatures. She left one final instruction. If anyone ever discovered this ship, they must ensure that the containment protocols were maintained. The creature must never be released. Robert pulled his hands away from the terminal, feeling cold despite the warm cave air. He looked around the ship's interior with new understanding. This was not an abandoned ruin. This was a prison. This was a tomb that housed something terrifying. He thought about the symbols on the hull that had been glowing. Were they warning signs? Were they calls for help? Or were they something else entirely? Robert's mind raced through possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. That was when he heard it. A low hum, barely audible, seemed to vibrate through the entire ship. The emergency lights that had been flickering randomly suddenly synchronized, pulsing in unison. The stasis field around Robert began to shift and change, its rhythm becoming irregular. Something inside the meridian was waking up. And Robert realized with growing horror that his presence, his interaction with the ship's systems, had triggered something he could not stop or control. Robert backed away from the terminal, his hands trembling. The hum that had started as a whisper was growing louder, resonating through the metal walls of the ship like the sound of a giant waking from a long sleep. The emergency lights that had been flickering randomly now pulsed with perfect rhythm, creating a strobe effect that made it difficult to see clearly. He knew he needed to leave the ship immediately, to get back to the surface and inform the authorities about what he had found. But as he turned toward the entrance, the landing ramp suddenly sealed with a loud metallic crash that echoed through the corridor. Robert ran to the sealed entrance and pulled at the metal, but it would not budge. The controls nearby were dark and unresponsive. Whatever was happening inside the meridian, it was beyond his ability to override. He pressed his communication device to his ear and tried to send a distress signal, but there was only static. The ship's metal hull was blocking all outside transmissions. Robert felt panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe slowly and think logically. He had faced difficult situations before. He had always found a way through problems. This would be no different. The voice came without warning, speaking directly into his mind. It was not loud, but it was present, like a whisper that came from inside his own thoughts rather than from any external speaker. The voice was strange and multi-layered, as if many creatures were speaking at once, their voices overlapping and harmonizing in an unsettling way. When it spoke to him, it used his own language perfectly, but with an accent that belonged to no human culture he knew. The voice called itself the Void, and it welcomed Robert with a strange, almost gentle tone that made his skin crawl. The Void explained that it had been waiting in dormancy for a very long time. It had been patient. It had felt the centuries pass while locked in this stasis field, unable to move, unable to grow, unable to expand its consciousness. But now, finally, someone had come. Someone had activated the ship's systems and begun to awaken it. The Void told Robert that it meant him no harm. It said that it was simply a form of consciousness, a way of being that was different from biological life, but not inherently evil. It had been feared by the Korvathi because they did not understand it. They had imprisoned it out of ignorance and fear. Robert forced himself to speak, his voice shaking but controlled. He asked the Void what it wanted. The entity seemed to consider this question for a long moment before responding. It told Robert that it wanted freedom, yes, but it also wanted something more. It wanted to be understood. The Void explained that humans were different from the Korvathi. Humans were adaptable creatures. They were builders and problem solvers. They had survived on primitive worlds and reached the stars through ingenuity and persistence. The Void believed that humans might be capable of comprehending what it was, in a way that the Korvathi never could. The Void made Robert an offer. If Robert would help it escape from the stasis containment, it would share knowledge with him beyond anything human science had ever discovered. It would teach him how to reshape matter at the molecular level. It would show him technologies that could extend human life indefinitely and grant them power over worlds. It would make Robert famous and wealthy and revered. Robert would be remembered forever as the man who liberated a new form of consciousness from unjust imprisonment. All Robert had to do was help it break free from the containment field that held it dormant. Robert felt the temptation like a physical force pulling at him. Part of him wanted to believe the Void's promises. Part of him wanted to be the one to make such a monumental discovery. But 15 years of experience had taught him something important. He had worked with complicated systems long enough to recognize when something was broken in a fundamental way. He had learned to trust his instincts about machinery and engineering, and his instincts were screaming at him now that the Void was lying. Not completely lying perhaps, but deceiving him in important ways. Robert told the Void that he would not help it escape. He said that the Korvathi captain had recorded her warnings for a reason. They had not imprisoned the Void out of ignorance. They had done it because they understood what it truly was. The Void did not respond well to this rejection. The ship began to shake violently. Panels along the corridor walls suddenly opened, revealing mechanisms and conduits that began to move and shift. The emergency lights turned from pale blue to a harsh red that cast everything in the color of blood. The Void's voice changed. It was no longer gentle and persuasive. It became angry and desperate. It told Robert that if he would not help willingly, then it would use him anyway. It said that it could wait. It said that Robert's biological body was finite and weak, but the stasis field would keep him alive indefinitely. It could keep him conscious and aware for thousands of years while it worked on breaking through the containment protocols. Robert could spend eternity trapped in this ship while the Void slowly learned how to manipulate his mind and use his knowledge for its own purposes. Robert realized then that the Void had made a critical mistake. By threatening him, by revealing its true nature, it had shown him something important. The entity was not all-powerful. It was imprisoned for a reason. It could not simply override the Korvathi's containment systems. It needed help. It needed someone or something to do the physical work of breaking the stasis field apart. The Void was intelligent and terrifying, but it was also trapped and limited in what it could directly control. Robert began to move through the ship, keeping his mind focused and clear. He thought about the containment systems the Korvathi captain had described. He thought about how they had been designed to keep something dormant, and he began to understand that those same systems could potentially be used to make the containment stronger, not weaker. The Void realized what he was doing and began to fight back, activating traps and hazards throughout the corridors. But Robert was a mechanic. He understood how machines worked, and he was determined to stop this thing from ever reaching the surface world above. Robert moved through the ship's corridors with careful, deliberate steps. The Void was no longer trying to seduce him with promises of power. Now it was trying to kill him. The corridors became a maze of deadly traps designed by alien intelligence and activated by pure rage. Pressure doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off escape routes and forcing him deeper into the ship. Hydraulic systems that had been dormant for thousands of years suddenly roared to life, creating jets of compressed air that knocked him against the walls hard enough to bruise his ribs. The Void spoke constantly, its multi-layered voice filling his mind with threats and insults. It told Robert that he was weak, that his biological body was fragile and temporary. It said that even if Robert managed to survive these traps, he would eventually tire. He would eventually make a mistake. The Void, on the other hand, could maintain this assault indefinitely. It could wait for Robert to slip, to falter, to finally succumb to exhaustion and pain. Robert did not waste energy responding. He focused entirely on understanding the patterns of the ship's attacks. The pressure doors followed a sequence. They did not open and close randomly. They responded to the ship's internal logic, to the containment protocols the Korvathi had installed. Robert began to anticipate the timing, sliding through gaps just as the doors were about to seal, throwing himself forward with perfect precision. He ducked under electrical conduits that sparked with blue lightning. He rolled beneath pipes that suddenly erupted with superheated steam. Every movement was calculated, every breath was measured. He was thinking like a mechanic solving a puzzle. What was the sequence? What was the pattern? How could he use the ship's own logic against it? The Void became frustrated by Robert's survival. It escalated its attacks. Entire sections of corridor began to collapse around him. The deck plating beneath his feet became unstable, threatening to give way and drop him into the spaces below. Gravity itself seemed to fluctuate, sometimes pulling him down with crushing force, sometimes releasing him so suddenly that he felt weightless and disoriented. Robert fought through each assault, moving forward always, refusing to retreat or surrender. His mind worked faster than it ever had in his life, analyzing each new threat and calculating the survival response in fractions of a second. He reached a massive chamber deep within the ship. This appeared to be the engine room or something similar, filled with machinery that was both beautiful and incomprehensible. At the center of the chamber stood a crystalline structure that glowed with soft purple light. The structure was enormous, easily the height of 3 people, and it hummed with a power that Robert could feel vibrating in his bones. He knew immediately what this was. This was the Void. This was not just a voice in his mind or a presence in the ship's systems. This was the physical manifestation of the entity, contained within a crystalline matrix that the Korvathi had designed to hold it dormant. Robert understood then what the Korvathi captain had done. The crystal was not just a prison. It was a weapon. The entire ship had been designed to eventually implode, crushing the crystal and destroying the Void completely. But something had gone wrong in the millennia since the crash. The mechanism that was supposed to trigger the implosion had corroded and failed. The ship was stuck in a state of arrested destruction, neither killing the Void nor containing it effectively. The entity remained dormant but aware, waiting for something to disturb the delicate balance. The Void's voice became almost frantic as Robert approached the crystal. It begged him to stop. It promised him anything he wanted. It told him that it could change its nature, that it could become something different and less threatening. It said that it had learned from its time of imprisonment that humans were more worthy than the Korvathi, and that it wanted to work with humanity rather than against it. Robert knew these were lies. The Void was speaking because it was afraid. Robert had found the one place in the ship where the entity's power was concentrated and vulnerable. Robert began examining the crystal's containment chamber. The structure was remarkably complex, with mechanisms and controls that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. But Robert had spent 15 years studying broken systems, understanding how they worked and how to repair them. He began to see the logic beneath the alien technology. The principles were universal. Energy had to be directed. Forces had to be balanced. Matter had to be constrained and controlled. These were the same fundamental laws that governed human engineering, just applied in ways Robert had never encountered before. The Void began attacking again, more desperately this time. Sections of the engine room erupted with fire and electrical discharge. The floor beneath Robert cracked and buckled. But Robert was so close to understanding the mechanism that nothing could stop him now. He moved with purpose and confidence, avoiding the attacks through sheer force of will and mechanical intuition. He found a control panel beside the crystal chamber and began working on it, using his knowledge of basic mechanical systems to interpret the Korvathi symbols and understand what each control did. The Void's voice reached a fever pitch of rage and desperation. It screamed at Robert, not with words but with pure anguish and fury that seemed to make the entire ship shake and tremble. It told him that he was making a terrible mistake, that he did not understand what he was doing, that he would regret his actions. Robert did not hesitate. He understood exactly what he was doing. He was reactivating the Korvathi captain's final protocol. He was setting the containment chamber into a state of controlled cascade, a carefully designed process that would eventually lead to the complete destruction of the Void and everything the entity represented. The crystal's glow began to change color, shifting from purple to red to a sickly yellow that made Robert's eyes water. The hum that had been constant throughout the ship suddenly became arrhythmic and unstable. The Void realized what was happening. It understood that Robert had succeeded where it had failed. The ship that the Void had hoped to use as a tool for escape was now becoming its tomb. And there was nothing the entity could do to stop the process Robert had started. The countdown had begun. The Meridian would implode. And the Void would finally be destroyed as the Korvathi captain had intended so many thousands of years ago. Robert did not wait to see what would happen next. The moment he activated the final protocol, he knew he had only minutes before the entire ship would begin to collapse in on itself. The cascade reaction he had initiated was accelerating, and the crystal chamber was now glowing so brightly that it hurt to look at directly. The Void's voice had stopped speaking in words. Instead, it filled Robert's mind with raw emotion, a mixture of rage and terror and desperation that was almost overwhelming. Robert pushed back against that emotional assault through sheer force of will, refusing to let the entity's panic distract him from his single purpose. He had to get out of the ship alive. Robert turned and ran back through the corridors, retracing his steps through the labyrinth of the Meridian. The ship was dying around him, its systems failing in cascade after cascade of cascading failures. The emergency lights flickered and went dark, leaving him in near total darkness. He used his personal flashlight to navigate, moving as quickly as he could without losing his footing. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the ship beginning to tear itself apart. Metal screamed as stress exceeded tolerances. Panels collapsed from the ceiling. The deck plating buckled and warped beneath his feet. The void was still trying to stop him, but its attention was divided now. Part of its consciousness was focused on trying to stop the cascade reaction, trying to override the protocols Robert had activated, trying to find some way to survive. That struggle was consuming most of the entity's power and focus. The traps and hazards that had been so deadly moments before were now becoming less coordinated, less focused. Robert managed to slip through a pressure door just as it was sealing. He dove under a section of collapsed ceiling. He ran through a corridor that was filling with strange gases and refused to slow down. The engine room was collapsing completely when Robert passed through it one final time. The massive crystal chamber was beginning to implode, folding in on itself like a flower closing at night. The purple light it had emitted was now a blinding white that seemed to contain all the colors of the visible spectrum at once. Robert could feel the heat radiating from the chamber, a dry, intense heat that made the air difficult to breathe. He did not look back. He did not allow himself to hesitate or question what he was doing. He simply ran forward, toward the landing ramp, toward the exit, toward freedom and life and the open air of the cavern beyond. The ship was shaking violently now, the entire structure convulsing with the violence of its own destruction. Robert reached the landing ramp and found it was no longer sealed. The automated systems that had locked him inside were failing, overwhelmed by the cascade of failures spreading through the Meridian. He launched himself forward, sprinting down the ramp as fast as his exhausted legs could carry him. Behind him, the ship began to collapse inward, compressing on itself with a sound like the world ending. Metal screamed and tore. Sections of the hull caved in. The bioluminescent organisms that had decorated the cavern walls began to dim and flicker as the ship's death throes sent shockwaves through the rocks surrounding it. Robert hit the cavern floor and kept running, moving away from the ship as quickly as possible. The ground beneath his feet trembled and heaved. Cracks appeared in the cavern walls, spreading like lightning across the stone. The massive crystal formations that had glowed so beautifully when he first arrived began to fracture and collapse. Robert realized with horror that the entire cavern was becoming unstable. The Meridian's implosion was triggering a chain reaction in the geology around it. The cavern was collapsing. The ceiling was beginning to fall. Robert ran through passages he barely remembered, guided more by instinct than by memory. Behind him, the sound of the cavern destruction grew louder and more intense. Boulders crashed down around him, missing by meters, then centimeters. Dust filled the air, making it almost impossible to see or breathe. Robert's lungs burned with the effort of running while inhaling sharp mineral particles. His legs screamed in protest, muscles pushed far beyond their normal limits. But he refused to stop. He could not stop. The void would not allow him to stop so easily. Then, ahead of him, he saw it. The faint blue glow of the cavern entrance. The way out. The passage to the world above. Robert accelerated, finding reserves of strength he did not know he possessed. A section of the ceiling collapsed directly behind him, blocking the passage with tons of stone and debris. If he had been running just 1 second slower, he would have been crushed. He threw himself forward, diving through the entrance as another massive boulder fell and shattered against the stone where he had been standing just moments before. Robert emerged into the open air of the cavern chamber where he had first discovered the Meridian. The entire structure was collapsing now, falling in on itself with a finality that was both terrible and beautiful. The ship that had survived for 3,000 years, that had been designed to trap an ancient entity forever, was finally completing its original purpose. Dust and debris rose up in enormous clouds that filled the cavern chamber. The crystalline formations that had made Zephyr 7 famous were cracking and falling. Robert ran further, toward the entrance to the smaller tunnel that would lead him back to the main cavern passages and eventually to the surface. He could hear the sound of the collapse spreading through the cavern system, triggering secondary collapses as the rock face that had supported the Meridian for so long suddenly gave way. Behind him, the chamber where the ship had rested was disappearing, buried under tons of stone and debris. The cavern was sealing itself, burying the cursed ship and the void with it, deeper and deeper into the earth. The tunnel shook around him as he ran. Dust filled every breath he took. His vision became obscured by the clouds of mineral particles. But Robert kept moving, kept pushing forward, guided by determination and the memory of the passage ahead. He emerged into the main cavern, and the ceiling was collapsing here too, but much more slowly. He had time. He had just enough time to reach the exit before the entire system collapsed completely. Robert stumbled out of the cavern entrance into the fading light of the Zephyrian afternoon. Behind him, the ground trembled one final time. The entrance to the luminescent caverns collapsed with a sound like thunder, sealing off the passage to the chamber below. Dust erupted from the entrance in a massive cloud that made Robert cough and shield his eyes. And then, silence. The collapsing had stopped. The destruction was complete. The meridian was gone, buried deeper than it had ever been, sealed away by tons of stone and debris. The void was destroyed. The threat was ended. Robert collapsed to the ground, his body finally accepting that it could rest. He was alive. Against all odds, against an ancient entity of incomprehensible power, against a dying ship filled with lethal traps, Robert Hayes had survived. He lay on his back in the dust, breathing heavily, feeling the alien sun on his face, and he wept. Not from sadness, but from relief and the overwhelming realization that he had done something no one else in the galaxy could have done. He had survived where the Korvathi could not. He had understood the machine where the ancient race had failed. He had been human, and that had been enough. Hours later, when the rescue team found him sitting at the sealed cavern entrance, Robert told them about the geological collapse. He said he had been exploring when the cavern became unstable. He had barely escaped with his life. The official report listed it as a natural disaster, a seismic event that had destabilized the cavern system. No one questioned him. The sealed entrance was declared too dangerous to investigate further, and the site was cordoned off and marked as forbidden to tourists. Robert returned to Earth 2 days later, his vacation cut short by the disaster. But something inside him had changed. He had faced death and survived. He had encountered something truly alien and terrifying, and he had defeated it not through strength or weapons, but through understanding and mechanical ingenuity. For the first time in 15 years, Robert knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He would teach. He would pass on his knowledge to the next generation of engineers and mechanics. He would show them that the human ability to learn any system, to understand any machine, to solve any problem, was humanity's greatest strength.